Go.
Hi everyone, welcome to our talk. Today we'll talk about focus and penultimate vowel lengthening in Zulu. Languages differ in how they realize focus. In languages where the location of pitch accent is flexible, like English, pitch accent placement can be manipulated to make sure that focus has the strongest pitch accent in a phrase. Other languages that don't have this flexibility use other ways to mark focus. Zulu is such a language. In this talk, we'll argue that in Zulu, prosodic prominence falls on a fixed position and movements occur to put focus in this position. Like in many other Bantu languages, in Zulu, focused elements must occupy the immediately after the verb position, short for IAV, and must be the only nonverbal elements in VP. In other words, they must be VP final. Unfocused elements that originate in VP must move out. So a canonical word order for a ditransitive is in 1, with the word order subject, verb, indirect object, and direct object. Now, when we focus on the indirect object as in 2, notice here that the direct object undergoes a syntactic movement outside of the VP. And this is indicated by an object marker on the verb, which agrees in class with the displaced direct object. Also, every parenthesis in these examples indicates a prosodic phrase. And at the end of every prosodic phrase, we have penultimate vowel lengthening. So notice here that ubuti gets penultimate vowel lengthening as its penultimate vowel is long. When we focus on the direct object as in 3, the indirect object then moves out of VP, which is isita. And this again is indicated by the object marker on the verb, which agrees in class 7, with the displaced indirect object. And the indirect object also gets penultimate vowel lengthening. To account for these facts, Chung and Downing proposed that the immediately after the verb position is prosodically prominent. Therefore, focus must occupy this position. This, however, leaves open a question, which is what's the domain in which the IEV position is prosodically prominent? In this talk, we'll present our finding, which is, as is indicated by durational measures, focused elements which occupy the immediately after the verb position carry the strongest stress in a sentence. Therefore, focus must be prominent in a sentence. As Kumalo and Chung and Downing have argued, prosodic prominence can be realized through phrasal stress, which can be marked by penultimate vowel lengthening. Penultimate vowel lengthening, short for PVL, is lengthening of the penultimate vowel of the last word in the prosodic phrase. The more PVL we get, the stronger the stress is on this word and the more prominent it is. Our finding in this talk is that the VP final / IAV position has the greatest degree of penultimate vowel lengthening in the sentence, which suggests that the VP final position carries the strongest stress in the sentence, and focus must occupy the strongest position in the sentence.
So going through the basics of focus in Zulu again, recall, as we said, that the focused element has to be immediately after the verb. So Chung and Downing, in a previous paper, have derived this pattern with a high-ranked constraint, which is that foci have to have penultimate vowel lengthening. There's one problem with this, though, which is that penultimate vowel lengthening not only occurs in this immediately after the verb position, but also in other positions. So, for instance, in the pre-verbal subject and position, we get penultimate vowel lengthening. So in 1 and 2, for instance, we can see that we get penultimate vowel lengthening on the subject president, Umongameli. And also in elements that occur after VP. So again, in 1 and 2, we see that we get penultimate vowel lengthening on Ngiasonto, on Sunday. So if foci are only required to have PVL, then they should be allowed to occur in any position with PVL. So for instance, a focused preverbal subject should be able to stay in C2. However, contrary to this prediction, focused subjects need to be clefted, which puts them in immediately after the verb position. So we can see in 4, this is an example of a subject focus sentence. And what we see is that the subject needs to appear in a cleft construction in which it's immediately after a copular verb. this U verb here. So we can see that subjects as well follow this IAV constraint. So our hypothesis is that the immediately after the verb position is more prominent than other phrase final positions. Previous work by Downing suggests that relative degree of penultimate vowel lengthening reflects relative prosodic prominence. So our prediction is that the IAV should have more PVL than any other phrase final position. So we'll compare the degree of penultimate vowel lengthening in the immediately after the verb position with the degree of penultimate vowel lengthening in an unfocused position. So as a preview of our result, we find that the degree of penultimate vowel lengthening is greater in the immediately after the verb position than in any other position within a sentence. So to account for this, we would like to constrain Chung and Downing's constraint, which is that foci have to have PVL further. We'd like to say that foci have to have the greatest degree of PVL within a sentence. One consequence of this result is that foci have to have the greatest PVL in a sentence and therefore will carry sentential prominence. One further question is whether penultimate vowel lengthening in these cases occurs due to focus or due to being in this VP final position. So in the second part of our talk, we'll compare the degree of penultimate vowel lengthening in the VP final position when it's narrowly focused versus when it's not narrowly focused and just happens to be VP final. So for instance, in cases of broad focus. The preview of our result is that we find no significant difference in the degree of penultimate vowel lengthening between these two conditions. This suggests to us that it's not focus that makes the word prominent and that sentential prominence invariantly falls on a fixed position, that is VP finally. The data that we used in this talk comes from a single speaker of Zulu from Durban, South Africa, who lives in Boston. We're working on finding more speakers so that we can replicate these results. And we presented our data in slides. We pooled all of our data together and randomized them. And the data was analyzed with a linear mixed effects model with random intercepts and slopes by sentence pair. So as I said, our hypothesis is that the VP final position is more prominent than other phrase final positions, and our prediction is therefore that the VP final position should have more penultimate vowel lengthening than any other phrase final position. So in the first part of the talk, our data is separated into 3 parts. So each part is going to compare the penultimate vowel in the VP final position, which is this focused position, with an unfocused position which also undergoes penultimate vowel lengthening. So there are 3 specific unfocused positions that we compare. The post-VP sentence medial position, the post-VP sentence final position, and a pre-verbal position. So starting off with this post-VP sentence medial position, this is the data for part 1. Here we're comparing, again, the VP final position with an unfocused post-VP sentence medial position. So what we're doing here is we're comparing the penultimate vowel length of, for instance, isita in 2, in which it's in the VP final focus position, with the penultimate vowel length of isita in 3, in which it's in the post-VP sentence medial position. So we're always comparing the penultimate vowel lengths of the same lexical item. We're comparing between themselves. So we compare isita in 2 and 3, and ubuti in 2 and 3. So looking at the results, what we find is that the VP final, the focus position, is on average 62 milliseconds longer than the post-VP sentence medial position. So what that says is the penultimate vowel of the object in this, this VP final position, isita in 2, is on average 62 milliseconds longer than in this post-VP sentence medial position.
The second part of the materials compares the focus position with this post-VP sentence final position, which is not focused. So the data, which is 5 and 6, are almost identical to the data in part 1, except that they don't have a sentence final adjunct. Therefore, putting, say, a theta in 6 in this sentence final position. So again, here we compare the penultimate vowel of theta in 5 and 6. And same for ubuti in 5 and 6. And what we found is a significant difference. The VP final position, the penultimate vowel in the VP final position is on average 54 milliseconds longer than the penultimate vowel in this post-VP sentence final position. Finally, the third part of the materials compares the VP final position with the pre-verbal unfocused position. So in this case, we would compare iteki in 7, which is under narrow focus and therefore VP final, with iteki in 8, which is in this pre-verbal position that nevertheless also undergoes penultimate vowel lengthening even though it is not focused. So again, we find a significant difference here. The penultimate vowel in this VP final position, like iteki in 7, is 46 milliseconds longer than the same vowel in this pre-verbal non-focused position, that is in iteki in 8. So as an interim discussion, the findings described thus far indicate that narrowly focused elements which occupy the VP final position carry the strongest stress indicated by the highest degree of penultimate vowel lengthening in a sentence. A further question then arises about why this is the case. We consider two possible theories. One is the VP final position always carries the strongest stress in a sentence, regardless of focus status. And the second is focused elements independently receive stress regardless of position. To preview the result, we didn't find any significant difference in prominence of the VP final position across focus conditions, suggesting A may be correct.
So the first part of the analysis, we take another look at data from part 1, where we compare the degree of PVL in sentences like 1, which is a broad focus sentence, in which the direct object, in this case ubuti, occupies the VP final position. And we compare the penultimate vowel lengthening in sentences like that to sentences like 3, in which ubuti occupies a VP final position under narrow focus. So here we're comparing only direct objects. We're comparing the penultimate vowel length of ubuti in 3 to the penultimate vowel length of ubuti in 1. And we see that there is not a significant difference between the penultimate vowel lengthening in these two positions. We also compared an analysis specifically on monotransitive constructions, and I'm not going to go through it for reasons of time, but it shows very similar results. So the previous slides showed us that there's no significant difference of PVL in the VP final position, whether the element in this position is under narrow focus or broad focus. So this, in combination with the results from the previous section, suggests to us that the strongest stress in a sentence is assigned to this position, the VP final position, regardless of the information structural status of a sentence. Because the VP final position is the most prominent in a sentence, the facts that we've observed can be taken to support our constraint, which is that foci must undergo the greatest degree of PVL in a sentence.
Again, back to the cross-linguistic generalization we brought up at the beginning. Languages differ in how they realize focus. In languages where, say, pitch accent placement is flexible, like in English, they can manipulate pitch accent placement to make sure focus has the strongest pitch accent. But for languages that don't have this flexibility, they use other ways to mark focus. One famous example is Hungarian, which has a dedicated pre-verbal position for focus to which contrastive focus and answer focus move overtly. It's been argued that this movement is driven by prosody, because the pre-verbal position receives sentential stress, focus moves to this position to get sentential stress. Note that our analysis is strikingly similar to this analysis for Hungarian. Parallel to Hungarian focus, Zulu focus must receive sentential stress as well, which falls on the immediately after the verb position. Also similar to Hungarian, Zulu has focus-driven movement. But instead of moving the focused element, in Zulu, it is the non-focused elements that move. And by moving out of the way, they make sure that the focused material receives sentential stress. To conclude, in this talk, we provided evidence for the claim that the VP final position is prosodically the most prominent within a sentence, and syntactic movements occur to put focus in the VP final position. We hope to do more research to determine whether the other defining aspect of the IAV position, that is, its placement immediately after the verb, is also prosodically driven. We also hope to verify these results with more speakers and through a perception study to find out whether speakers are sensitive to the difference that we found to be statistically different in this talk. Thanks to everyone who has helped us achieve the results in this talk, and thank you for attending.
Thank you.